Hi, everyone. I'm Krista Cowan. I'm the corporate genealogist here at Ancestry. And joining me today is Erika Manternach. She is the publications team manager at Ancestry ProGenealogists. And today we are going to be talking all about oral history interviews and all the whys and wherefores and hows. And if you've got specific questions about that, please put it in the Q&A. I will let Erika take over, but I will interrupt her if you've got questions that we need answering. So Erika, thank you so much for being here.
Yes, thank you for inviting me. This is one of my favorite things to talk about. And I know you feel the same way. You've worked with so many people for so many years, and I know you understand how important it is to talk to the people we love and get the stories and the details and the memories that they know that we may not know. And I've really become passionate about it over the years. I have a background in journalism where I was always interviewing people to try to get stories, news. But when I moved into interviewing people for the purpose of gathering family history, it just became so clear how important this is for families to be able to talk to someone and gather what they know about grandparents or their own life story, their values, wisdom they want to share with younger generations. So it's been really fun to help facilitate that for people. And this came about largely because my team of writers and graphic designers at Ancestry ProGenealogists, we create family history stories and books. And so we are working with our genealogists who have found all these records about a family, and we help them put it into a chronological story and add context about what was it like to, be on the ship when you were immigrating, or what was it like to serve in the war, or what about your little town, place where you lived, is important to be able to understand your life. And it very quickly became clear that we needed to talk to people who knew the more recent generations, or who even have had stories passed down from earlier than that. And to be able to say, how did you celebrate special occasions in your family? Were you together for family dinners every week? Tell me about your grandma's personality. Was she a warm, lovey grandma who put you on her lap and read books, or was she maybe a little more stern? And these are the things we can't usually get from records. Nothing against the records we find. Those are the foundation of our books. But you can't find those kinds of things on a census record necessarily. You can't say, what were your best childhood memories of going over and staying overnight at grandma and grandpa's house. So I always say, this is where the story is really enriched when we're gathering this for future generations. And we create our books to last forever. We use archival quality paper. We want this to be around. I always have a question in the interview. People reading this 50, 100, 150 years from now, what do you want them to know about you and your upbringing and your life story, your career, whatever it might be? Um, the other thing that I've learned is people, I I believe one of the best gifts we can give another human being, whether we're related to them or not, is our attention and our curiosity to say, what do you think about that? Or tell me about your life. Tell me about your experiences and how they've shaped who you are and the sense that you've made of those experiences. Um, I think that's just one of the nicest things we can do for someone else, to say, your story matters. And I want to know it. We convey that in interviews or even just in conversation by, asking follow-up questions, which we can talk about more later if we want. Eye contact, just body language, nodding and saying, wow, yeah, tell me more. Because I think people are hesitant sometimes to share a lot about themselves. They don't want to sound like they're bragging. They don't want to sound like they're taking too much of the floor. But once you get them going and they kind of walk down memory lane, it's amazing what comes up. And it's amazing what emotions come up. I talked to a gentleman last week, and his son, who is the primary client we're working with, said he does like to talk, but he doesn't really wear his heart on his sleeve. He doesn't, get into a lot of emotional stuff. What he probably came to almost to tears about 10 times during our interview, because maybe it was because he was talking to someone who, didn't know all the ins and outs of the family, or maybe it just was finally the release valve, on some of those stories and memories. It was all good. It was just, talking about how much someone meant to him, or I want you to know how great my mother was and how she did so much in the community. So these are the reasons I think it's important for people to find a way to gather these stories and memories. I talk to so many people when they're getting ready to do a family history book, and they say, "Oh, who would have known that?" And I didn't ask. And none of us really, when we're kids, think to ask grandma, what was everything like when you were my age? Sometimes they offer that information, but it's a very important thing to gather it while you can. So many people say, oh, I just have a voicemail message from them that I just can't get rid of because I just want to hear their voice, so to record these and to have the voice and have them telling the story in their voice is such a gift for living relatives and future generations. So I don't know, I'm sure some of that resonates with what you've uncovered. You have done so much with your own family and so many of our ancestry collaborators, but it's really a blessing and a privilege to be able to help facilitate that, and to help people do that if they want professional help, or to just give them some guidance about how to do it at the next family gathering with their own relatives, and maybe just a little app on their cell phone to record the conversation. So,
Love that. Yeah, I have so many questions already.
oh, good, good,
Questions
good.
of my own, questions from some of our viewers. But let's just start with this. When you're trying to decide who in the family to interview, um, are there some guidelines around that?
Hmm. Um, Often people will say, oh, there is a certain person in the family who is kind of our go-to. When we have questions, I know Aunt Elaine is going to have a lot of that. She has a lot of the pictures. Sometimes it's a matter of who inherited what from past generations. Oh, you got the shoebox of photos, or you got the scrapbook they made back in 1970. And so they may just have access to some of those things in their home. Certainly as people age or maybe fall into worsening health, that's definitely, a good time to talk with them as much as possible. But we never know how long we have with anybody. And I say, if you can, interview your siblings and your cousins and your aunts and uncles. Why not? It may be several conversations over the years as life changes and babies are born and people get married and all those things. But and it doesn't have to be an overly formal process either. Some people say, "Oh, I have to sit down and have 90 minutes or 2 hours set aside, and they have to be available." And no, I mean, you can even do it in the car. You're driving somewhere with someone, you have your cell phone, and say, I never asked you about what things were like when you were going to school. What are the highlights or the lowlights from when you were in high school, or what activities were you in? And just record those little snippets and gather them up. We like to, recommend when we get to the holidays, so Thanksgiving, everybody's cooking, right? Where did this recipe come from, Grandma? Just tell me the story of that. I have an uncle who, when we were really little, would tell us the best bedtime stories. And if I had only had a way back then to record them, he would do voices, and it was just an absolute delight whenever we visited their house, because we would all, get ready for bed and wait for Uncle Don to come and tell the stories. So those things, those little everyday things that we would miss, or that just kind of come up in natural conversation or come up because you're curious about them, just ask a question and record it. Make a little collection of mini recordings. Even that is very helpful. If you want to do more of a sit down and let's really talk about this for a while, I've done that with my parents and with my husband's parents. And I like to focus on maybe a certain portion of their life. Like today, let's just talk about childhood up until you graduated from high school. Next time, we'll talk about, what happened after high school, meeting each other, getting married. And then we'll talk about family life and career, and retirement years, whatever. Kind of putting some parameters around this discussion so we don't feel that anxiety of, oh, we have to cover everything in, the time we have today. But so there are lots of ways to go about it. And, there's no one right way. And I always talk to people when they ask me to do interviews. Okay, tell me a little about the person. Do they like to talk? Are they going to be a little hesitant? Are they, going to talk a lot about, go on a tangent maybe, which is not always a bad thing. Um, but I really say anybody in your life who you love and value and you want to know forever, to have those stories and those memories, just, start working on it with the first one you can.
Yeah, love that. So it's so interesting because we're at such an advantage today that we didn't have when I started doing family history,
Uh,
40 years ago. We used to have to break out the cassette recorder and, sit down and be a little bit more formal about it if we wanted to capture any kind of audio or video recordings. Now, every one of us is walking around with a device in our pocket that
yeah,
captures better audio and video than any device I had growing up. And so we can do it, I think, a little bit more bite size in natural moments, pull up your video and film grandma making that recipe in the
yeah,
kitchen at Thanksgiving time and ask her to tell the story while you're recording her. And that just feels a little bit more organic than sitting down necessarily formally to do an interview. You
yeah,
also said something that sparked an idea, which is like we often think about how much we regret not getting interviews from people before they passed, but and so the advice is always interview those older generations first. But I
mhm,
love the idea of interviewing your siblings and your cousins. Like, I'm the oldest grandchild. The youngest grandchild is 18 years younger than I am, my cousin. We had
mhm.
very different relationships with my grandparents because my grandparents were entirely different people, 20 years later when she was growing up. And so her memories of my grandparents are very different than my memories of our grandparents. And so as we kind of combine those stories or get their perspective, I think that gives us a really like lovely rounding out of some of the family stories. And then even children, like if you've got kids or grandkids, I see, everybody the last few weeks has been posting their kids' first day of school pictures with the, sometimes they hold the little board with what grade they're in and whatever. But how hard would it be to just turn on the video camera and ask them, it's the first day of school. Like, what's your favorite color right now? What are you reading? What do you like to eat? Like, just ask them simple questions that get them in the habit of like sharing part of who they are. And I think if you
Yeah.
raise them in that environment, then they will show that same curiosity to other people. And you end up creating an environment of family storytelling that can be really beautiful.
Yeah, yeah. It's okay to ask questions. Oh, I welcome your curiosity. Those kinds of things. You made me think of two funny things. One of them's funny. My grandma would share her recipes by saying, and then you throw in a blop of this and a blop of that. And to have
Wow.
video, to say, show me what a blop is. If I ever share this recipe, and I have shared the recipe with other people, like I'm gonna need to know what you think a blop
Yeah.
is. And that's what I think. And I think about my sister who just took her eldest to college, and got him set up there in freshman year and all the emotions that go along with that. To be able to say, okay, I didn't do this, I should have. It just what you said made me think of it. But tell me what you're feeling as you're kind of moving him into this next stage of life. Let me know what your real-time thoughts are, because 20 years from now, that's going to be fun to listen back to. You
Yeah.
know, capturing his
Yeah.
memories, do change or fade a little bit as time goes on, but capturing those moments as they're happening, you make great points about that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. So Linda has an interesting question here. She says, I'm in my mid 70s and have no one left to interview except myself. Is a self interview a thing? Like, is that, and
Oh,
how would you go about that?
wow. Certainly, I think a self-interview is possible, and I would go about it the same way you would if you were going to interview someone else. I come up with a plan and a strategy. I don't think it's bad to just kind of go into a conversation ask questions that kind of come to you in the moment, if that's better than nothing. But whenever I do an interview, I try to think of, okay, how should we start? How should we structure this so that one thing leads to the next? And, there's a certain element of putting people at ease at first, which if you're interviewing yourself, you don't really have to do. But, say, what would be most interesting if you were asking someone else about their life? And just put those questions into your plan and then go through them. Okay, yeah, so what do I remember from high school? And just launch into it as if someone has asked you the question. And I think that's great. And, you can explain at the beginning of the recording, that's what you're doing. You just wanted some guideposts about how to get on a recording and start gathering your thoughts and memories. And so you thought the self-interview would be the best way to go. So I like that idea. I hadn't thought about it
Right?
before.
Super fun. Okay, you've mentioned a couple of times having a plan. So, can you give us, there's a couple of questions here from people about like what that looks like. You mentioned like, it doesn't have to be 2 hours. It can be a shorter time period with your in-laws. You sat down and structured it around a specific time period in their life. It sounds like you also probably, though I don't think you've stated this explicitly, maybe have a list of questions about
Yeah,
that topic that you can lean on if conversation lags or you need to be a little bit more direct. But what does that planning phase look like?
sure. When I do an interview for one of our clients, my first step is to go to the tree, honestly, and to say, okay, they were born in this year, and that means they didn't get to meet their paternal grandfather, but they probably knew their paternal grandmother because she lived until they were 42 or whatever, and kind of figure out who might they have known well, and go to that person's profile and look at their kind of life story. What documents do we have about them? They moved from here to here. That's something we can ask about. Did you know why they moved? Um, and and really creating kind of a format or an outline of what I think they might know. They may not. They might say, "Oh, I lived on the opposite side of the country. I didn't ever get to go see her," But they likely heard stories about that person. And so, and I also come into the interview and I say, I'm probably going to ask you questions you don't know the answer to, and that's totally fine. My job is to really explore what you might know and where that might lead us. And if you just didn't know it, we'll move on. I like to start the interview with some easier questions to help people feel more at ease. When you say, I'm going to turn the recorder on now, sometimes people are like, oh my gosh. And I say, okay, we're not on live TV. Everything can be, amended later if you think of the date, whatever. This is not high pressure, but important to record for all those reasons we talked about. But I still like to start by saying, okay, so I guess, you probably knew your grandmother really well, don't hit them with the the hardest questions at first. I really have seen people ease into that memory lane as time goes on and they really start getting their mind into that part of their history, things start flowing a little more. So start with the easy things. I do like separating it in. If this is like a mom or dad, you have a lot of questions for them, a lot of periods of their lives to explore, to say, today, let's just cover this much. Next time we'll do this, next time we'll do this. I like to keep interviews to maybe 60 to 90 minutes because beyond that, it starts to get tiring for everyone, mentally, your voice, all of those things. So doing it in segments is really good. Um, and you have your list of questions, maybe written down, maybe on the computer, if you're on Zoom and you can reference it. Um, Things are not going to go just like you have it planned. People are going to answer a question you have on the second page when you're on the first page of questions. And so you have to always do some reorganizing. And you have to do that mentally while the interview is going on, but you don't want to stop actively listening. So it's okay to say, okay, I'm going to listen through to the end of this answer. Then we'll take a minute, process, think about where do I want to go next. I think that's fine. Having a little bit of breathing room in the interview is fine. Um, and yeah, the tangents will sometimes take you to another part of of their lives, and you say, oh, well, really today I just wanted to stick with high school. We'll get to that at another time. So trying to give them a little guidance about what are you wanting from me? And everybody's kind of in that interview situation thinking, am I giving you what you're looking for? And so to give them some feedback about that and say, oh yeah, in fact, I have a follow-up for you. You said something that I hadn't heard before. Can you tell me a little more about that? Can you describe that a little bit more? Or how did you make sense of that? How do you view that experience now, 20 years later? Those kinds of things are very important in an interview. So being able to have that give and take and not being so tied into your question list that you kind of don't see those opportunities to ask for more detail.
Yeah, so many good nuggets in there, Erica. Like, I love this idea of as the interviewer, like you're probably going to be a little nervous too. And
Yeah.
so just take your time, but the most important thing is that you listen. Like you showed interest enough to set up the interview and to go through this process. So
Yeah.
listen to them and be curious and ask follow-up questions. And all of that just means you need to relax and
Mhm.
recognize that you're just having a conversation. The other little thing you snuck in there, which I don't know if everybody caught, so I just want to make an underline under it. You mentioned Zoom. I was
Yeah.
having a conversation with a colleague here at Ancestry. Actually, I was interviewing her for my podcast, and she talked about how she has a Zoom call with her grandma every week, and she loves the stories that come out. And my first question to her was, are you recording those Zoom calls? And she goes, no, it never occurred to me to do that. And I thought she has this opportunity every week where she spends this time with her grandma and she's not been recording any of it.
Oh,
So it's so
yeah.
easy just to hit record when you're on a Zoom call and you don't even have to worry about setting up equipment or most of us just are so used to doing that now, but it just never occurred to her to record the call. So I think that's a great way to do that as well, especially if you're not in proximity to the person that you want to interview. Setting up a Zoom call is a great way to do that. So that
Yeah.
brings me to my next set of questions, and I'm seeing a whole lot kind of in this vein. So as you're recording, whether it's Zoom digital recordings or snippets of video that you're putting on your phone or audio files or like all the we're going to amass a bunch of media essentially. How
Mhm.
do you keep that organized?
Oh boy. Well, that's a good question. And it really depends on how you're going about it, how many people you're interviewing, labeling things immediately after you've recorded them. I number interviews. If I'm doing multiple interviews with a particular person, I number them. There are other transcription and recordings software opportunities out there too. Otter is one that many people use, and so if I record on Zoom, I'm also recording on my phone, and I'm probably recording on Otter because I do multiple ways of recording just in case something went wrong. And that will bring up a starter transcription. I call it a starter transcription because not, as good as AI is getting, it's still not getting everything right when you're transcribing, but it will give you a big leg up on transcribing an interview. I immediately label it and export it. I export the audio and the transcription, usually after I've cleaned it up. And I put it immediately into the cloud or my personal storage, whatever way you have of organizing your photos and these kinds of things. It's really important to do that immediately so things just aren't hanging out there unlabeled. You know which one came first, if you're numbering them 1, 2, 3, or even by the date. I always like to say when you start the recording, the first thing you should do is say who's present, what day it is, and where you are, just to give people context at the beginning so that we know, okay, this one was done on this date in 2025. Um, so those are just a few guidelines about doing it right away, making sure that you've exported it into your own files so that you have it in the place you want it. If I'm recording with like a dictation recorder almost with microphones and everything, then I'll put the file immediately on my computer and make sure I have it organized the same way. And We use, as you know, Google Drive to keep track of a lot of our files here, and I keep all of my client work in their client folder. But I think you could certainly do the same thing for your family and have maybe folders for different people that you've interviewed. So you have not only the recordings, but the transcripts there at the same in the same place.
Yeah, such great advice. And I think that's one of the things that starts to overwhelm people. Like for some people, it's the getting ready process that overwhelms them. For some people, it's the actual sitting down and interviewing someone that makes them a little nervous. And then for some, it's that like, well, then what do I do with all of this stuff? So you've really walked us clearly through kind of those three pieces. And I love that. For me, I use Google Drive as well.
Mhm.
I keep a spreadsheet of the interviews I do and then have the like raw files, the raw audio files, the raw transcription files all on Google Drive in a folder system. And then I actually like we edit some of them, right? And so I don't know if your team does that work as well, or if you just are doing it for the purposes of creating the books, or you're actually taking this footage and doing something with it, audio or video.
Yeah, we don't get into editing it often. We have done some of that in the past. I've also done interviews with a videographer for, locally, but also when I would travel to interview people. Um, but your initial question was editing and how you kind of pull that in. What was the other part of it? I forgot now.
No,
I'm not.
just wondering if you do any of that, or if there's value
Oh yeah.
in like because we're interviewing these people because we want the information, but I
Yeah.
hope also there's an element of how we think about what we do next with that, like how we share it. So in your case, professionally, you're creating these books for clients based
Right.
on those interviews you've done. But are there
Yeah.
other ways that people could take that
Oh yeah.
footage, the audio files from those and without sharing the raw hours long interview files? Are there ways they can share it with their family that make more sense? I guess that's what I'm asking.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we are getting better technology about how to take little snippets of an interview and possibly even putting them on an ancestry tree at some point. We'll see, like be able to put them on people's profiles, crossing fingers, right? Um, but in terms of I would say it's about half and half with the oral history interviews we do here. Most often they are preparing us to put quotes into a book. So we're going to be pulling out pertinent quotes and placing them in the part of the story where it makes the most sense. Other people come to us and say, I just want to give, I don't maybe want to do a full family history book. I just want to have this conversation recorded and I'd love to have the transcript. Whether it's a Microsoft Word doc of just the question and the answer, but we also offer small publications that are basically a beautifully formatted interview, questions and answers with a few family photos in them. And those can be done fairly inexpensively. And people give them as gifts to their family. This year I had Ancestry ProGenealogists interview grandma. We got her whole life story, all the info she knows about her ancestors, and it's in this transcript, and we've published it. And it's a beautiful, gift to give to people because they have that. And then, of course, you can share the audio files. We always share that with all of our clients. Just here, here's the Zoom recording if we have it. If we only spoke to them on the phone, here's the audio recording. And then people can file that. But yeah, I do think more and more people are starting to ask about, can we do this on video? Or can we at least have, like you and I are doing on Zoom, can we have that recording? And some people are even getting it more into like, let's make a mini documentary, and that kind of thing. So I do think there's demand for that as well. So yeah, editing out
Yeah.
certain snippets that you can share. That's kind of next level technology, knowing how to do that, but it is possible. And there are a lot of tutorials out there about it.
Well, I was going to say we've got like kind of a generation of young adults coming up now who are digital
Know exactly
natives,
how to do it.
right?
Yeah.
They've been editing TikTok videos on their phone for years now. So maybe that's a great way to get other family members involved in a project like this. If you're the one as the family historian or the genealogist who's doing the interviews, hand that off to a kid or a grandkid or a niece or nephew who has those digital skills, and give them some parameters or not, like just let them see what they come up with. I think it's a great way to involve them in family history in a way that is native to the technology they're used to using.
Exactly. Capitalize on everybody's skills, and
Yeah.
feels more like a group or a family effort to do that. So I love it.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a lot of questions here, and I just want to address a couple of these around preservation. So you're talking specifically again about the books that Ancestry ProGenealogist creates for clients from these oral history interviews. I don't know if you have one handy that you can show on camera, or if that would be weird with your background or whatever. People are just asking like kind of what these look like.
Is it possible to share a screen?
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
I bring one up. Probably should have had one up to show a sample. We have a lot of samples, clients who have said, yeah, it's fine to share these with people who might be interested in doing the same. Just have to click around and get there. Whoop, I logged out of everything so I wouldn't have dings
Oh,
going.
you're fine. While
Oh, yeah.
you're pulling that up, let me just kind of address a couple of these other questions. So, one of them has to do with how, if you present something digitally to family, how you do that. And so, I think one of the things that you need to keep in mind is that you can share your tree on Ancestry, and audio files can be uploaded to your tree. And then you can tag the people in the tree who are either like the people speaking in the audio file or the people who are being talked about, the stories being told. So video is not yet available on Ancestry, but audio files can be. So one of the things that I do with my video files is I upload them to YouTube right now, unlisted. So they're not going to be found in a search. Nobody else is like, the only way you know that video exists is if you get the link. You
Uh-huh.
can then put the web link to that video in your tree. And again, attach it to any of the people mentioned or speaking in the video. And that's a really great way to share it with family so that all the information is in the context of the
Uh-huh.
family tree. And so that's kind of how I've been organizing things and moving some of our, not just the interviews that I've done, but also some of our old home movies that we've digitized. And like we've got, some old audio and video files that we have since digitized. And then one other thing that I just want to make sure that people understand is there's been a few questions here about the preservation of digital media. And so one of the things I love about the work that Erika and her team do is that they create these physical books. And then those physical books obviously are not going to, be corrupt files, or they still are fragile in that they can get lost or ruined in a any kind of natural disaster or whatever, but they're tangible. With digital files, you have to keep migrating them. And so I have old 8mm movies from my grandpa that I had transferred to digital and put on a DVD. Now we don't have DVD players. I don't even have one in my computer anymore. So we've had to transfer that DVD file to a file, like an MP4 file that we have on the cloud. Like, so you have to kind of keep up with digital migration as technology changes. And that's to be expected. That's true whether you're dealing with a video or whether you're dealing with, a photograph, or, I've got old slides from my grandparents that we've digitized and had to migrate a couple of times. So you do have to kind of keep on top of that. But as you build up that digital library of things, I would just recommend making sure that you're not the only one who has access to it. So make sure that you shared it with other family members, so that all that effort to digitize or interview people is accessible to more people than just yourself. Okay,
Absolutely.
you found the book or found your screen share?
Yes, yes, I'm opening this one other one here. So I will share, I have a couple pages from an oral history transcript that we created for a family. And it shows not only that you can put the family photo on one page, but this is how we format the interview on of the text. So you have the question that I asked and then the full transcript. Even a few of the reactions we like to put in there if we can get them. So this, I believe, was something around 80 pages, and we were able to incorporate, 6 to 8 photos in there, but the full text of the questions and the answers. And those are published in either a hardcover book with a lovely engraved title, or there's another color cover that we can do in that 8.5 by 11 format. I was trying to see if I could get I should have had one up here, but a sample of a book where we did some interviews and seeing how we can incorporate the quotes into the book, the narrative of the book. I'm scrolling through one, but I can't remember if we did interviews for this one. I don't think so. But yeah, lots of opportunities there for how to just share this with other people, the recording or the written transcript in a variety of different ways.
Yeah, fantastic. And how big are those books usually?
The transcript books are almost always 8.5 by 11.
Okay.
Yeah, and
And then like just for like kind of scale, like an hour-long interview, about how many pages of transcript would that be? Do you know?
hmm, good question. I would say probably 25 to 30
Okay.
pages.
Okay.
Um, Let me show you this. It's another picture of the inside of one of these books. It might give you a sense of the size. This was for the same family, but a different transcript. So another beautiful photo of the couple we were talking about. This interview was there with their 6 children. So it was in sections, as you can see here, it says track 3. So I think we did several sessions and we just, had a little divider in there in between. Oh, it wants to get big and small.
Yeah.
So, but all of our work is really customized to what the family wants, what they're going to find most useful. It's one of the first questions I like to ask is, who's going to be reading this and enjoying it?
Yes.
Is it a lot of cousins? Is it only your kids? And what are they going to appreciate the most with this book? And that's how we try to structure it.
I love that concept of beginning with the end in mind, right? Like I think for so many of us as genealogists, sitting down and having an interview or a, family history question and answer with somebody is for us the end goal. Like we want the information, we want the stories. But I
Yeah.
think kind of stepping back and thinking, what are we going to do with this information? Why am I building this family tree? Why do I want these stories? How am I going to preserve them and share them? And what might that look like? For some people, it might just look like, telling and retelling the stories in the family and continuing that oral history tradition. For some families, it might mean printing a book. For some, it might mean just finding ways to maintain the digital archive, as it were, of the family history. And so thinking about what your end goal is and who you want to share it with, I think helps you kind of back into the best way to go about kind of doing
Yeah.
this from the beginning, which I think is super useful. Irene has a really great suggestion that I'm going to pass on to you because I think it's an interesting idea, and you may have
Oh,
already thought about it or do it. She says, "What about incorporating QR codes into those books that lead to the actual audio files? Is that something you've ever thought of?"
yes, we have experimented with that a little bit.
Love that.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent way to, have that access to the tech side of the story, as well as having it in the book. Yeah,
Love
great.
that. And then another question about the books is, are you including like graphical representations of the family tree and the records and the documents, or are the what you're creating primarily story based and picture based?
We do all kinds. In our typical family history books, which this is actually one right here. This isn't my home library. This is just a pretty picture. It's not in my home library, but this is kind of an exterior of one of our family history books. And that larger size, the 11 by 14, almost coffee table size, that allows us to do a beautiful family tree chart at the beginning. We can do those in the 8.5 by 11 size too, but it has to be, because of size limitations, you can't do it. You usually have to start and do a vertical one. But it is an add-on that we can do even for something like a transcript where you can see how people are related to each other. It becomes very important when you're talking about grandma on this side, grandma on that side, um, and that is often one of the deciding points for a family. Someone comes and says, I want my kids to have the story of all their ancestors, moms and dads, but maybe dad's cousins are not so interested in reading about mom's cousins, and so maybe we just do a smaller publication on one side of the family and another one for the other. Other people say, no, let's put it all together. This is for my kids and grandkids, so that's why I say that's the first question. We have to think about who are we serving by starting this work, and how will it live for many generations in the best way for your family. So
Yeah. Yeah. It's so funny because I think about when I read like really intricate, character heavy fiction books. I love when they put like a family tree at the beginning of the book or a
yeah.
map or like that graphical representation so that you can keep yourself kind of grounded in where are we and who are we talking about. And, I think that that's a really important piece of that. And so, as we think about, and this is for all of us, as we think about how, what the end product is, who the audience is, how we want this information to be passed on, consider that, having that family tree is an important piece of making sure that the stories have a hook to hang on and context around who these people are and how they're related to each other. The family tree does that beautifully. So I love that the two work well together.
And we will often have the big tree with everybody at the front. And then as we create our stories, we generally do them in chapters. Chapter one is on this family line. And so we'll put that portion of the tree at the start of each chapter. So we can have a really great visual reference just as we're about to dive into the story of all those ancestors in a little bit more focused way at the start of the chapter.
Yeah, love that. Okay. Um, People have suggestions.
Oh,
There's
good. I am always,
like we could create a fold out family tree at the front of the book so that it could be bigger.
yeah, yeah,
Um, Somebody else is like, we should sell a template so that people can create their own books.
yeah,
People are loving this. Okay. Um,
good.
so Mark, again, Mark, let me just answer your question. Erika is with Ancestry ProGenealogists, so it is part of the Ancestry family. She is the lead of the publications team. So there are professional genealogists who do family history research. Her team specifically focuses on oral history interviews and creating these family keepsakes, making sure that those stories get told in a really lovely way if you've been following along. And then to the person who asked who the lady in the purple is, I'm Krista Cowan. I'm the corporate genealogist here at Ancestry, and we're talking about oral history interviews. We have a few more minutes and a few more questions, and so I'm gonna hit you with a hard one.
Okay.
And then we'll round it out with maybe some other opportunities for capturing some of these stories. So
Great.
the first hard question is, what do you do when people are hesitant? Like there are some people who just don't want to talk about their family stories, or maybe they have memory issues. Like, are there tricks or tips or advice for approaching people who might be hesitant or uncomfortable? And then maybe part of it is because they have memory issues, or maybe they just don't like talking about the past. How do you navigate some of those conversations?
Mhm. A couple ideas there. As I said, starting with questions that are simpler and easier to answer helps put people at ease right away. Telling them again, you don't have to worry about this being recorded because it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to take a long pause and try to think back. You're not being put on the spot. Nobody likes to really be put on the spot. Um, and creating that flow, it's really the job of the interviewer to help put the person at ease. They say, this is really informal, but it's very important because these things are going to be important to the family members who are listening. Try to help them understand the value of this for the future. That no, many people do not like to talk about the hard things that have happened in life. And I always say, let's focus on how you have overcome the difficulty, how you have made sense of it, how it has changed your values and your perspective on life. Those are the important things that are going to be useful for future family members to say, you know what, they got through it. They had this happen to them. They lived through the depression. How did they do it? To help them understand how valuable their story is. I mean, many people will say, I don't have anything to say. I don't, it's going to be a really short interview because I don't know. I don't have much to say. I had this guy that the transcript that I showed you, he came into the office to do his interview in person, and he got there and he's like, this isn't going to take very long. And we sat down and we started going, and I had to eventually cut him off at 2.5 hours later. I said, okay, we all need to take a little break. He just got into it, and he understood eventually as we kept talking. And as he saw the things that I was following up on, I would say, okay, so you might think that part of your career is boring, or you might think it's not so important how you met your wife, but you know who's going to be really interested? Your grandkids, or, and to help them understand that there are going to be times where they say, I just don't want to go there. And, you can try nudging a little and comforting and talking about the value of it. But at a certain point, you do have to say, okay, I respect that, you know. But there are other parts of your life that, are maybe easier to talk about. And when the interview stops and the recorder goes off, that memory part of your brain is going to keep percolating. And especially if you have a follow-up interview, they may come back and say, okay, I've thought about it a little more, and here is something that I'd like to share. Sometimes it takes a little while to let that idea settle, and to help them to be comfortable. I never want to put people in a position where I'm forcing them to say something or taking them down into territory that's just really painful. But I do like to say, you took the brunt of that pain. How can your descendants learn from what you went through, and how can they appreciate how hard it was, and how can that shape their view of this topic or their perspective now, and encouraging them to see how they should feel proud of that.
Yeah, as I listen to you share kind of some of the ways you navigate these conversations, I hope people are taking good notes because you've dropped some really great, like little one-liners and ways you phrase questions. But what keeps coming back to me is when you are interviewing someone about themselves, you have to put yourself in the position of the interviewer. And I think that might be a little easier for you, I suspect, because you're doing this professionally. And so you're removed a little bit from the situation. So I think, I think back to when I would interview my grandma before she passed. She had dementia. She was, her memory was going for years. And there were a couple of little tricks I used. One was I would play music from the 1930s and 40s. And that would she would always perk up, and then her memory would, I love that memory would start percolating. Like it
Yes.
would, because that music would draw her into that space in her mind. But also I had to remember I was there to interview her. I wasn't just having a conversation with grandma. And it wasn't about me sharing my stories or interjecting or judging or, arguing or trying to get her to tell the story the way I wanted her to tell the story. Like you have to kind of divorce yourself a little bit from your emotional connection to this person when you're interviewing them if you want them to keep talking and keep sharing, because so many people will just shut
Mm-hmm.
down if they feel like they're being judged or if they feel like they're not able to tell the story the way that they remember it without you trying to interject the way that it really is. And so I think
Exactly.
just kind of navigating that can be a little tricky, which is why I'm grateful that there are professionals that can do this, but if we want to do it ourselves, we need to be cognizant of that.
Yeah. I love that you brought up playing music. I mean, that's really the concept of music therapy for people,
Yeah.
right? That it can take you back to a moment in time. And that is especially true for people who are starting to have some memory loss or dementia. The music can really be the gateway. You could also have newspaper articles or family mementos, keepsakes. You could say, tell me about this beautiful quilt. I know, my great great grandmother made it, or this came across the plains with the family, or whatever it might be, that having a physical object can really lead them into those memories as well. You talk about, the difference between a family member who already knows all the stories you're trying to preserve. Sometimes that is a benefit, and sometimes it can hinder things a little bit because they will assume, well, you already know this. I don't know why I'm telling you again. And I'm going to give you a really short version of it because I know you know it. But if I, who don't know the family very well, am starting the interview and saying, okay, tell me from the beginning, what led up to this and how did it go? You're probably going to get a more complete telling of the story with more details, and not necessarily referring just to grandma, but to say Grandma Martha Peterson. They will specify, and that's important for the longevity of this interview. People listening 3 generations from now are going to say, "Well, who was grandma?" And I always try to say that to people. If you're going to talk about grandma, just try to see the whole name, because that is going to last longer and be easily understood by more people. So yeah, just a couple other tips there about, um, you know, when it's best to do the interviews yourself because you have the comfort level versus no, you're going to maybe get a more complete version of the story by someone who doesn't have that history already known.
Yeah. Okay. Which brings me to the next hard question, which is about hard questions. And you kind of alluded to it a minute ago about like you don't have to go into painful experiences. You don't have to let them relive trauma if they've experienced messy, hard things in their lives, which everybody has to one
Hmm.
degree or another. But how do you like, are there other tips about how to approach those hard things, like in a way that allows them to share their story, to share that information? And then kind of with that, like, what if they don't know things or there are hard truths that like,
Mm.
how do you like, do you leave it on the table? Do you interject it into the conversation? Like how do you manage that?
Yeah, some of it is what is the relationship you have with the person, and what's your level of knowledge going in. Certainly, we come across those things, or sometimes people will say something and we know because we have records that that is not quite right, But to give them to say, first of all, when you're talking about something that's very hard that they don't really want to give you all the details about, maybe focus on the aftermath, like, okay, whatever that hard thing was, how did it shape you? How did this difficulty change your views on this or that, and to at least be able to get some of what only they can say. I always like to say the interview is really looking for those things that only they might be able to share. Um, and and how have you, again, come through that in a different way, and changed? And that is sometimes a way in. Sometimes, honestly, kids being involved in the interview can help because you say, certainly there are topics and messy things you wouldn't want to talk about with kids. But for instance, if it's someone who hesitates to talk about their experiences in the military or during wartime, to say, what do you think it's important for a young person to know about that experience, about that war, about that particular battle, about being away from your family? You can talk about aspects of it. How nice was it for you when you got a letter? What did you carry with you when you were a soldier? Trying to get at some of that experience without having to go into the things they may have seen. That's where it gets really difficult for people, and you don't want to cause trauma or cause these painful memories to sort of take over the interview. But I think, considering before you start, and again, that's why it's important to plan and strategize. I know maybe Grandpa doesn't like to talk about this, but what are some aspects of it or things that were going on at that time that he would be more comfortable talking about? Sometimes it can open a door and then you get in there and you have a little more trust. um, it really is a practice of building trust,
Yeah.
and like I said, putting people at ease, and no, I'm not going to go broadcast this out on YouTube. This is really just for our family to know and understand. There's another aspect where people say, no, I don't want this to be widely shared, but I do want my grandkids to know, and that's something to be honored as well.
Yeah. Oh, Erica, I wish I had had that advice from you 20 years ago. I asked my grandfather repeatedly through my childhood and teenage and young adulthood years to tell me about his time in the war. And the three times I asked him, he refused. And if I suspect if I had asked him instead, tell me about what you carried with you, or tell me about, like some of those tangential things that weren't, tell me about your experience in the war, he might have been a little more willing to talk about it. And I
Yeah.
regret I didn't have those skills and those tools available to me at the time.
Well, and sometimes when you know you have someone who was in a difficult wartime experience, you don't want to just hit them with a question like, "Tell me about what it was like to be in the war."
Yeah.
That's an overwhelming question. But as you say, like, um, what did you eat? What was the diet for a soldier? What were you able to take leave and explore some of the area that you were in? What was that like? Meeting people in that culture. Those are some of the aspects that can help us at least get into that time period a little bit with them and have something to go on about what they brought back with them.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, so good. We could talk about this forever. Unfortunately, we are out of time. The last question that people have, and dozens of people have this question, so I don't know if we can help them or not, but they've all been trying to write fast and furiously as we've spit out possible questions. But is there a list somewhere that people can get to help them kind of prep for some of these interviews of possible questions to ask various family members?
Yeah, there are some websites out there that will give you some questions as a starting point. Just type in what to ask in an oral history interview. Some of them are going to be applicable to your situation, some are not, but they will give you ideas. Um, I always like to ask, what lessons did you learn from someone? What impact did they have on your life? Um, what were the high points and the low points of this period of your life? How have you made sense of this or that? And at the end, I just as when I was in journalism, the last question of an interview is always, what did I not think to ask you? What else is there that you think is important for people to know 100 years from now about your life, who you are, what your family's values are, and any advice you for those future generations? And they always have an answer. Well, actually, they might sometimes say, no, I think you covered it, except blah, 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 blah. And then they'll come out with a beautiful kind of summary of who they are and what they want people to know. So I definitely recommend ending with that question. And certainly, I have sort of some guidelines that I use when I'm creating interviews, but I really try to customize the tree. And I think they know what the overall focus of the interview is going to be and try to tailor it to that as much as possible.
Love that. Thank you so much. Thank you for your guidance and your wisdom and sharing your experience with all of us. I think it's going to be valuable for a lot of people. For all of you who are watching, thank you so much for being here, whether you're watching this live with us at our Wednesday virtual event or watching the recording on YouTube. Would you please, before you go, do one thing for me, live in the chat or in YouTube on the comments, just leave us one new thing you learned today. That's super helpful for us to continue to tailor these virtual events to where you are and the things that you're learning. I think it's also useful for you to actually articulate what you learned. You're more likely to remember it. Erika, thank you again so much for being here. I just loved this conversation. We might have to do a part two at some point. lots,
Absolutely.
lots of questions we didn't get to. Unfortunately, the time went way too fast, but thank you. Until next time, everybody, I'm Christy Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.